Distinguished scholars and dear participants, Namaste and good morning. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all at the International Conference on Understanding International Migration. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. NICE has four research centers: China Studies, Neighborhood Studies, Non-Traditional Security Studies, and Defense and Security Studies. And it focuses on eight major research topics. Refugee and migration is one of our major research topics. In 2020, we published around 250 research articles, organized around 100 events, where around 800 scholars participated at different lectures and international conferences. We have also hosted Professor Noam Chomsky, Professor John J. Mearsheimer, Professor Stephen Walt, Professor Stephen de Krasner, Professor Robert O'Cohen, Professor John Lewis Gaddis, former Prime Minister of Nepal, former Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand, uh, former current State Minister of Education of Maldives, Foreign Minister of Nepal, and Education Minister of Nepal. We have also got a State Minister of Regional Cooperation from Sri Lanka, senior academicians like Kishore Mahbubani, Foreign Secretary of Sri Lanka, Dr. Jayanath Nambage, former Foreign Secretary Nirupama Rao, Vice Admiral of Japan Yoji Koda, and several scholars and officials from different parts of the world, like former Foreign Secretary of India Lalit Mansingh, former Foreign Secretary of India Kanwal Singh, and a strategist of different think tanks of India and the region. We have also organized a webinar with reputed institutions like Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, Center for South Asian Studies, Fudan University, Jawaharlal Nehru University of Nepal, of India, and several other think tanks of South Asia. Ladies and gentlemen, international migration is one of the most important factor of global change. It happens due to various reasons: persistently inequality in wealth between rich and poor countries, impel large number of people to move in search of better living standards, political or ethnic conflicts in some region lead to refugee movement, and the creation of free trade areas like the European Union facilitate movement of labor. In recent times, climate change has also emerged as a driver of migration. Migration is not an isolated phenomena. Movement of commodities, capital, and ideas always gives rise to movement of people and vice versa. Global cultural interchange facilitated by improved transport and proliferation of print and electronic media has also increased migration aspirations. Conditions may be tough for migrants as they might experience abuse, exploitation, and discrimination, but they are preferably to the poverty, insecurity, and lack of opportunity at home. Yet sometimes it can be forced as well. Since international migration began to change the existing demographics, economies, and social structures, its political salience has strongly increased over the last century. A new cultural diversity has been created in the countries of immigration, which brings into question the manner in which identities, especially those of migrants, are negotiated across differences with the existing polity of host countries. While international migration has been keeping place on a large scale since the 16th century, with European migration to colonies across America, Asia, Africa, and Australia, the reverse trend after the Second World War led to a heavy influx of immigrants into former empires like the Great Britain and France, and from South to North America. There is significant migration from Africa and West Asia region to many parts of the world today, and also from Central and Eastern Europe to the West. The receiving countries have, in turn, over the last half of century, experienced a variety of social movements with different groups emphasizing in their ethnic, linguistic, or religious distinctiveness. They demand full and equal inclusion in society while reclaiming the recognition of their identities in their public sphere. This has brought into question the assumptions of congruence between political unity and cultural homogeneity into sharp relief. Ladies and gentlemen, this international forum aims to bring together rigorous and erudite scholars working on the migration issues from all around the world over a single platform. This conference is full-day event with 11 different sessions, with 2 sessions running parallel through white and green room. The conference features 73 scholars from 25 different countries who will be delivering their presentation and sharing their understanding on international migration. The session is also streaming live on YouTube, so please feel free to share it on your social media handle with hashtag ICUIM2021. Please do follow us on Twitter at Contact NICE and subscribe our YouTube channel NICE Nepal. I would like to once again welcome our distinguished scholars, guests, participants for the first session of the conference and thank them for their presence. In order to introduce about the conference, I would like to welcome Dr. Vijayta Mahendru, the conference coordinator and visiting fellow at NICE. Dr. Mahendru has worked days and nights to make this event a grand success. Over to you, Vijayta.
Thanks a lot, Pramod, for that brief introduction about the many issues that migration entails. In South Asia, while there's a very robust academic discourse on rural-urban migration, international migration receives somewhat less attention, and most of the discussion around international migration has been happening within area studies, whereby scholars do not get an opportunity to share their ideas and learn from others working in this swiftly upcoming field of research. All countries combined, South Asians are the biggest migrating units to most parts of the world and have a very convoluted and bloody history of border formation and mass cross-border movements of people within the region itself. Keeping these two issues in mind, it was high time that we, the scholars of migration from the subcontinent, be a part of an international platform with scholars from around the world to discuss international migration issues, trends, directions of academic discourse, forms of analysis, and many more aspects. We started with a humble plan, but the overwhelming response that was received by our call for papers due to the very broad base of the event, which was intentionally conceived to bring maximum perspectives on the table. We have here with us, as Pramod mentioned, 73 scholars from 25 countries in the world. This compelled us to have parallel sessions, which are thematically organized, discussing specific aspects like labor economics, gender, theories, Rohingya issue, climate change, and varied perspectives and case studies within migration, international migration studies. Participants can choose, now I'm talking to the participants, they can choose which panel they would like to attend and join the green or white room respectively. There are a few anomalies in the topics and sessions, but that was due to exigencies of compulsions, we faced for organizing an event across all time zones in the world. One of the most important objectives of this conference today is to bring together research in the field and create a platform for publishing. We are looking forward to your support in this endeavor of ours. Out of the 60 plus papers that will be presented today, we would like to definitely bring out at least one edited volume of articles in long form. Information regarding this will be shared with the speakers in phase 2 of our engagement on this project of understanding international migration. With this, I welcome you all once again to our day-long rendezvous with international migration and hand over the e-podium back to Pramod.
Thank you, Vijayta. Now I would like to introduce our chair and moderator of the first session, Professor Eleanor Nesbit. Professor Eleanor Nesbit is Professor Emeritus, Department of Education Studies, University of Warwick. Her research concerns the interference between religions and education. This includes a focus on the religious socialization of young Christians, Hindus, and Sikhs. She is currently investigating the religious identity formation of young people in mixed faith families. Her research interests also include the representation of faith traditions in religious education curriculum, religious nature, transmission of religious culture, Gujarat and Punjabi communities in the UK, Hindus and Sikh communities in the UK, Brahma Kumaris, Satya Sai Baba devotees, value education in UK schools, reflective approach to ethnographic research. In all these years, he has worked on numerous publication and research projects. Professor Nesbit, welcome, and let me welcome you once again, and over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Jawaharlal, and thank you to you and Vijayta for organizing what looks like a stunning half day or day of presentations covering so many different topics relating to so many different communities from so many parts of the world. And it's my great pleasure now to be introducing Dr. Guneeta Bhalla, who is the founder, 1947 Partition Archive, US, and Dr. Bhalla is going to be speaking on Partition, how British colonialism created the largest mass refugee crisis of the last century. So it's over to you.
Thank you so much for
Just a-
having me. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just a small announcement. I'm sorry. Just a small announcement. We request the audience, the participants, to please write down questions in the chat box, which will be taken up by the chair later. Thank you.
Okay, so back to me, I guess.
I'm sorry, Guneeta. Yes, sorry for interrupting.
No problem at all. So it's my pleasure, to be speaking today. Thank you so much for the invitation, Vijayta and Pramod. And thank you so much for the introduction as well. So yeah, I just want to talk to you guys about a little bit about partition. And we know partition today as one of the largest mass migrations of the last century, and potentially one of the largest mass migrations in documented history. So, we don't often, it hasn't been studied, in my opinion, to the depth, and it hasn't been sort of philosophized and understood to the level that it needs to be for us to understand where we are as a world and a subcontinent today. So let me just talk to you a little bit about our work and also a little bit about some of our findings, because it is a short talk. And I think without understanding how we do our work, it may be difficult to kind of understand how we've come to some of our conclusions. So, just as a quick recap, at the end of World War II, as you know, the British were quite bankrupt. There was a lot of financial issues that they were facing. And so it became very difficult for them to sustain their colonies, the biggest one being India. And so I do apologize, I'm getting a lot of messages pop up here. So following that, I'm not going to go into all the political decision making, which there's a lot that's been written about that, but the decision was made to pull out of the South Asian colonies, which, the British areas were called India. And the way that all of that unfolded ended up being quite sped up. So it ended up unfolding much quicker than they had originally planned. And so as a result, what ended up happening is it was decided that the areas that were Muslim majority, according to the census that was conducted in South Asia, would become Pakistan. And any kingdoms that were, in that area would be merged with this new country. And similarly, the areas that were non-Muslim majority would turn into India. And the same fate, awaited its kingdoms. And so the kingdoms were merged. I mean, a lot of times people ask me, people commonly say that we had one big happy India before and it was divided into two countries. It's absolutely not true. You actually had more than 560 countries in a way. They had these sort of like a protectorate type of a relationship with the British, similar in a way to what the US and Japan have today. But they were distinct kingdoms with their own identities, cultures, and so on. And it plays a really big role, later on when we define how the impacts unfolded. So the Radcliffe Line, as it's called, was drawn. It went through people's homes, farms, and so on. And it ended up creating a lot of chaos and huge migration during the transfer of power from the British government over to the new, governments that they were handing over the power to. So, it was Muhammad Ali Jinnah in Pakistan, and it was Nehru and Gandhi and the Congress Party in India. And during the transfer of power, I mean, from our oral history work, we learned kind of how it happened. A lot of times, in the civil services, for instance, when the British officers had to leave, it was very sudden, and they literally would just handpick somebody to hand over their position to. So the transfer of power was very haphazard, and it was not this clean, well-structured transfer of power, and it led to mass chaos. It led to a complete breakdown of society, especially in the areas where, you know, it wasn't clear where they were going to go. Was it going to, like Punjab, was a particular city like Lahore, were you going to end up in India? Were you going to end up in Pakistan? So it created a lot of confusion. So as a result of that, at that time, nearly 1% of the world's population became refugees due to partition. So just between 1946 and 1948, you have about 14 to 15 million people. And then if you look over the next 5 years, that number goes up to almost 20 to 22 million. That's about 1% of the world's population at that time. So 1 in 100 people. And then if you look at the impacts, because these people went all over the subcontinent, right? And so if you look at their impacts, they impacted nearly every place in the subcontinent. So that would be about 1 in 8 people in the world were in some shape or form impacted by partition, or 14% of the world's population. So pretty significant event. Yet for various, political reasons, it's starting to be in the last 10 years. There's a lot more authors, a lot more, work being done. But I feel like we missed a lot of years and a lot of decades of work that should have been done in order to understand where we are today. Just to give you a little background, inspired by the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, which you see in this photograph, we developed the concept for the 1947 Partition Archive, which was to be crowdsourced, which back in 2008, 2009 was sort of a very unusual concept in the world of oral histories and humanities. And our motivation for creating this was, well, in those days, people were like, oh, well, that's a forgotten story. Why do you want to document it? Well, imagine if you hadn't documented the Holocaust, right? Or Hiroshima, Nagasaki. I mean, maybe I'm speaking to an audience where it's obvious why we should be documenting this. But there is, by documenting those two events, we've been able to change the world. We've been able to understand how genocides take place, and quite often, not always, but quite often, figure out the red flags before something crazy is going to happen and intervene, right? Similarly with Hiroshima, we have the nuclear non-proliferation movement that came out because of that, because of our learnings from all of the survivors of Hiroshima. Yet we had, oh, I'm not sure what's going on. Yet we had partition, where we had, this massive migration, but not enough witness accounts. So there was a great urgency because the witnesses were aging at that time. And the idea that we came up with to document their stories was through crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing enabled a tiny team, our tiny team, to reach out to people, to teach people all over the world how to document oral histories within their communities. So we worked with the Regional Oral History Office at UC Berkeley and the History Department at Stanford University. We developed protocols on how to teach people how to document oral histories. We used the internet in those days, in the early days of the internet in South Asia, and we began training people how to document oral histories back in 2010. And people went out in their communities, they documented these stories on video. It was very clunky back then. We couldn't upload large video files. We were getting CDs and pen drives and so on from all over the world. So in this manner, we were able to document oral histories. Our official mission to document, preserve, and share eyewitness accounts from all ethnic, religious, and socioeconomic communities. So everyone, it doesn't matter if you're rich, you're poor, what community you belong to, your story belongs in the archive if were impacted by partition. And so having that philosophy has really enabled us to get a very deep and rich understanding of how every level of society was impacted by partition, and how also a lot of these migrants ended up, creating this wave of South Asian diaspora all over the world in the 1950s, because they didn't settle well in their new places, after their migration. So, we came up with the citizen historian program with crowdsourcing. It was for us a fast way to do this work because the population was aging. It was frugal. We didn't need to raise millions of dollars to travel everywhere. It was global and it was super engaging because now community members began talking about partition, and the story of partition just kind of came alive because of this work, because of thousands of these stories being told and then, being shared all over the internet. And it kind of really raised general public awareness, I feel. And just, we've done some research on that as well, which I don't have time to go over today. This slide kind of just shows you how it all works. We document oral histories by training people. People go into communities, record the stories, upload them, they get shared. More people get inspired to do the same. So to give you an idea, about 9,500 people have shared their oral history so far from 600, by 600 scholars from 12 countries, from over 500 villages and cities in 36 languages. And over 1 million people are kind of following these stories online and sharing them. You can see migration maps on our website. If you go, you can click on, a city, you can see where people migrated to. So we'd have a little bit of that interaction. You can click on a story, read it, or listen to it if we have a clip up. We're working with Stanford right now to beam these stories via their library so that they can become accessible online. And we also partnered with a number of universities in India and Pakistan where these stories are being made available to scholars at first. We're not making them completely public yet. We're doing a few studies on how they're received and if we need to put in any protocols. Just going to share a few learnings with you to give you an idea of how these migrations impacted people. Sundarbans, mangrove forest in Bengal that straddles Bangladesh and West Bengal in India. What's really interesting, so we interviewed this 108-year-old gentleman, just an example of one of the 9,500 oral histories. So this gentleman, he migrated to the Sundarbans, and he also told us the story of how back at the time of partition, a lot of people, a lot of families, about 4 million of them, because of their lower socioeconomic status, were given land in the Sundarbans that even the indigenous communities had rejected. So they were given land that was sort of low-lying, and unfortunately what's happening is these same families that were settled there are now becoming the first climate refugees that we have. So it's yet another migration, yet another displacement that's happening. So it's been a very, very, there's been a lot of turmoil with these settlements in the Sundarbans. You've probably heard of Mori Chapi and, all that's happened there. There've been sort of genocidal things that have happened because of people protesting, not wanting to be settled in this land. There's a lot of, tiger attacks and crocodile attacks that the population that was coming in was not sort of keyed into. They weren't, part of that environment. So a lot of conflict there on many, many levels. These are some of the tiger widows. Like I said, the indigenous communities would not live in this area. But then you have these people who began to live here, and you have these problems like the tiger widows because they were not adapted to that environment. Another example, this one concerns chai, which I've always considered to be a staple drink in South Asia. However, this 108-year-old gentleman, about almost 10 years ago at the time, he was 108. He educated us on how, back, I guess around 1910 or so, chai and tea were boycotted in South Asia because they felt that the British East India Company was trying to get them addicted to tea so that they would all buy it. So he till this day did not drink tea, but ultimately I think that tea addiction did succeed and it has become a staple drink in South Asia. But I was fascinated because I didn't realize that up until the British East India Company, chai was not a traditional drink in South Asia, in most of South Asia, not all, obviously, the mountainous regions, green tea and all of that. Another example, the gharanas, the arts were massively disrupted. When we think of Northern India today, for example, you don't think of the arts, you think of agriculture, You think of business, you think of military, but you don't think of the arts. That's because the arts were massively disrupted. A lot of the artisans who had to get up and move ended up becoming laborers because their art was no longer relevant or accepted in their new environments. And this is just an example of a gharana that was broken. A lot of languages, were lost at the time of partition because people, especially in small remote areas, when entire villages moved, when they moved to their new land, nobody, after one generation, nobody spoke that language anymore. This is actually not a story. This particular gentleman is from a Torwali tribe in western Pakistan. And the other fascinating thing that happens in the archive is that we end up also documenting rare languages. So he speaks Torwali language, which is a rare language. Another fascinating, story here. This is Erin Riggs, one of our citizen historians, now actually a professor at Urbana-Champaign. She's interviewing a gentleman who is a farmer Jew from, India. He belonged to the very ancient Bene Israel community. At the time of partition, many of the Jewish people who ended up, in what became Pakistan, like in Karachi, they ended up migrating to Pune and Bombay. And then from there, in 1948, they migrated to Israel. They were actually recruited through what's called a builders movement in India. A lot of the Indian Jews were recruited to move to Israel. So a lot of the younger ones moved into these kibbutz, communal living situations, and they left their parents behind forever. Some of them never saw their parents again in India. And he was such a gentleman. And then a lot of them eventually moved to New York, where this interview took place. Another massive piece of history, the history connected with the princely states has mostly been sort of swept under, but very fascinating identities there. A lot of people who lived in princely states did not live in British India. So for them, the transition to a democratic India was not necessarily a positive one, which is something I was very surprised to hear in interview after interview of this nostalgia for their Maharajas, and going back to the Maharaja days.
Guneeta, you have just one more minute.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
I'm sure you can develop more in the question time.
Sure. And so the one final thing I wanted to point out was, these stories of the many, many, many things that we're learning from them. One of them is the possible insights into the origins of the violence. We're learning neighbors didn't necessarily kill neighbors. In fact, neighbors saved neighbors. And we've interviewed a lot of people who contributed the violence at that time. And often they say that they were driven by the motivation for loot more than anything, so it was very economically driven. They were polarized by new leaders taking on, new constituencies during this shift to a democracy. New people were coming into power and, the breakdown of civil society, as I mentioned before. Anyway, it turns out a lot of this violence can be modeled in existing models, economic models. So what happened at the time of partition was not very unique. It's not that South Asians are weird, that, they started killing each other. Those are just some of the very interesting points that are coming out, that we're learning about this mass migration and the impact it still is having on us today. This is actually for Delhi. I'm sorry to put this in here. It just ended up in here by accident, but we have an exhibit going on at a metro station in Delhi that's ongoing. But yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. And that is my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for brilliant timing. And that was absolutely fascinating. Yes, and I always feel a sort of culpability as somebody from Britain hearing about the huge disruption of 1947 and thereafter. There are going to be questions, but what I will do is pool them all after we've had our 3 presentations. So do go on through the chat, submitting your questions. And it's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Vijayta Mahendru to speak. She's a visiting fellow at NIICE, and she's going to be presenting her thoughts on Sikh migration to the United Kingdom, early experiences. So it's over to you, Vijayta, for your 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I've slightly changed the topic of my presentation. It's now new voices in the early experiences of Sikh migration to the UK. So, over the years of my engagement with early Sikh migrants to the UK, I have come to an understanding that when it comes to migration historiography, there is a dominant narrative or a gamut of experiences that kind of forms that dominant narrative. Just like how memories work, and Guneeta's work in this area, she would know better. It entails a lot of myth making, common experiences being crystallized as facts, and something that probably happened with each and every migrant. But when it comes to the Sikhs in the UK, in my experience, I came across some very interesting experiences and perspectives which are not in common discourse, and some of which might be outrightly offensive to the grand narrative of Sikh migration in the UK. So, this paper is divided into three main parts. First is an overview of the history of Sikh migration to the UK. Second is the dominant experiential narrative of Sikh migration. And the third part will discuss some new voices in early Sikh migration. Part one. The first Sikh to have arrived in the UK was Maharaja Dalip Singh. The British acknowledged Sikhs to be a martial race, and following the annexation of Punjab in 1849 and the transfer of Maharaja Dalip Singh to Britain as a ward of Queen Victoria, large number of Sikhs were employed in the British Indian Army. For those of you who do not know this, Kohinoor diamond at the time belonged to the Sikh Empire. After the defeat of the Sikhs in the two Anglo-Sikh wars, the Kohinoor was also ceded to the British Crown through an agreement which an 11-year-old Dalip Singh was made to sign. Another interesting fact is that Maharaja Dalip Singh's daughter, who was also the goddaughter of Queen Victoria, was one of the most important suffragettes of the United Kingdom, who, alongside Emmeline Pankhurst and other suffragettes of the time, fought for women's voting rights in the country. The earliest Sikhs who went to Europe in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, were travelers of privileged class who returned home after their sojourn. The Maharaja of Patiala, Bhupinder Singh, especially, was like a he was a frequent visitor to London, and to socialize in the high society. He would always stay at Hotel Savoy. His children, as many other children of nobility from across British India, as Guneeta mentioned, there were so many kingdoms at the time. They would go to UK for further studies and for higher studies and sporting adventures. But it was only after the end of the first decade of the 20th century that there were some permanent settlers, Sikh settlers in the UK, mostly ex-soldiers who had fought for the British in the World War, and many of them worked as peddlers. The UK was a choice emigration destination because of the colonial linkage and some degree of familiarity with the language. Now, here we have to consider that Sikhs have generally been a very outwardly community. They've always kind of tended to migrate. It's Joyce Pettigrew, I guess, said that, every time a Sikh moves from his place, they are in their most permanent state, which is the state of being in transit. So, Sikhs have always been that kind of community. So these soldiers and all, who had any kind of familiarity with Britain and with the language, they tended to go emigrate, just experience new life, see what else the world has. The first Gurdwara in the UK was built in the year 1911 in Putney, Southall, with the help of the Maharaja of Patiala himself, indicating a sizable population of Sikhs in the UK at the time. So these this Gurdwara, which is commonly called the Shepherd's Bush Gurdwara, would remain the only Gurdwara facility for several decades to come. And I came across some people who lived in Scotland, Glasgow, who would, maybe twice or thrice a year on special occasions would come down to the Gurdwara to pay their respect. Otherwise, they would have, they would have some Gurdwara kind of facility in like a single room in an apartment or something. So, but the proper Gurdwara facility was the Shepherd's Bush Gurdwara only. The partition of British India in 1947 rendered millions of Sikhs homeless, and many migrated to the UK and North America, and of course, many migrated within India also. But what permitted the Sikhs and indeed other colonial subjects to migrate en masse to the UK was the passage of the British Nationality Act in 1948. When the World War II ended, one-fourth of the world's population was still British subject, but Britain remained a weak empire. Canada, in the meanwhile, passed a Citizenship Act in 1946, which kind of shocked the United Kingdom. The time to define itself as a modern nation state rather than an empire had come. But of course, there was a question of who would have citizenship rights in this new state. Who would they allow and who would be kept out? This was not an easy dilemma to be resolved. But in 1948, the British Parliament passed the British Nationality Act that gave all people of every British colony, as well as the British Commonwealth, the right to come and take residence as a full citizen in the United Kingdom. Koopmans and Statham say that a combination of paternalism and guilt guided the formation of the British Nationality Act. Soon after this act was passed, the ship Empire Windrush came to the shores of England with 500 people from the Caribbean islands and shocked the country. Scholars have noted that politicians in the UK granted this particular right, but did not really expect people to actually exercise this right. The influx of so many colored people shocked not just the politicians, but also the polity a lot. It took the country another 14 years to pass legislation that would put some checks to colored migration. Meanwhile, between 1948 and 1962, over 500,000 new Commonwealth, 500,000 new Commonwealth immigrants, that is immigrants of color, had entered the United Kingdom. These individuals and their spouses and dependents that joined them later, in later decades, constitute the bulk of United Kingdom's ethnic minorities today. Sikhs constitute a significant part of this immigrant population, and this paper discusses about the Sikhs who came to the UK before the passage of the Immigration Act 1962, that is the earliest immigrants. Now, part 2. The earliest immigrants are also called the 3-pound generation, as there were very strict currency controls, and for quite some time, people were allowed to, for a significant period of time, people were allowed to arrive in England only with 3 pounds. It was mostly men who were the first immigrants. They came and took jobs that required hard labor, construction, laying of roads, foundries, smelting factories, etc. In the 1950s and 60s, about 3/4 of Sikhs, unskilled, manual, low-paid jobs, Sikhs had to take, unskilled, manual, low-paid jobs and often had to work irregular hours or at night. Helweg says that Sikhs were perceived to be hardworking and they accepted jobs that English thought undignified. Employers liked to hire them. Most of the earliest Sikh migrants never learnt English. This is from the experience of one of these people, not because they didn't want to, but because there was no time for anything except work. They would communicate with their boss, who is called Gaffa by the Sikhs, at work via a middleman called Batu. Very soon, a supply chain network of Sikh workers was established and went all the way to Punjab, and these Batus doubled as job brokers as well as local landlords for the new migrants. The people who migrate bring with them a whole range of cultural milieu with them, and this period witnessed an emergence of bribery culture, a very intrinsic part of South Asian way of doing things. Intermediaries were paid a weekly cut or a one-off amount to land jobs, and the system was eradicated somehow by the help of trade unions. Double the number of people stayed in a house than the number of beds. So, one of the early migrant explains, I lived in a house with 3 rooms and 12 beds, and we were 24 of us staying there. The day shift people slept during the night, and when they went to work, the night shift people slept during the day. We used the public shower to clean up and would spend most of our free time drinking in pubs and playing darts and cards. Everyone was just saving up, most to buy own homes and a few to go back to India. So, it is this whole idea of, the first agenda for every Sikh worker was to save enough money to buy a house and get the family here to England. Sikhs today have one of the highest percentage of home ownership among all communities in the UK. And it is because the pioneer migrants who had agrarian roots were quite clear-cut in their idea of home ownership and land ownership. In this early phase, there was no luxury of asserting for rights, and Sikhs just wanted to establish themselves economically in the new country, and not to stand out. They just cut their hair in order to not face discrimination to get jobs. When it comes to experiencing colored discrimination, it began as soon as the locals began to encounter the incoming of colored migrants. While most of the language of discrimination was around the Black community, like signboards outside pubs reading "no dogs, no Irish, no Black," it implicitly meant that it included Asians as well. Mossman, the BBC journalist, while narrating a documentary film exposing racism, said that so far in Britain, few things could have been so ill prepared as immigration. The British Nationality Act was decided at the high tables, and the people of England had no say in it. Part 3, the new voices. While the British Nationality Act granted Commonwealth citizens the right to settle and work in Britain, there were unofficial. Now, I'm going to talk about things that are not so well known about Sikh migration, as I said earlier. So, the British Nationality Act granted Commonwealth citizens the right to settle and work in Britain, but there were unofficial controls on the ground. For a long time, the Indian government did not issue passports to ordinary people. Due to this, many Sikhs traveled to Pakistan. At that time, the border was also not, in the early days after partition, the border was not so fortified as it is today. So, a lot of Sikhs, they just traveled to Pakistan somehow. They changed their name, they cut their hair and got passports made. In a discussion about why Sikhs had to cut their hair in the early days of migration to the UK, one of the early migrants told me that the exigencies of the job market in England was there, but one of the main reasons for them was also to get. People did not care for issues like legality back then. They just wanted anyhow to get to England. If you can find the historical data, you will see that in the earliest years, there were more immigrants from Pakistan as compared to India, which was why brown people began to be called Paki in the United Kingdom. Because officially it was all migration from Pakistan and less from India. We might think we are different, but to a white man, we are all the same. Regarding the turban, it just became a thing in the villages of Punjab. As soon as anyone got their papers confirmed, Loki case katal karan chal pende si, yani, meaning that people would just set out to get their hair cut. As soon as somebody's papers were in place, that somebody would just, the first step of preparation to go to England would be to get their hair cut. This shows how pioneer migrants were willing to work around laws and make changes that were fundamental to their very being, just so that they could migrate and make their seek better lives. Another factor that the above statement highlights is that assimilation was not just unilaterally directed by the host society's norms, and part of it was also due to the migrants' own agency. Singh and Tatla state that the men would come clean shaven from Punjab itself, which would sometimes get to work immediately upon arrival. One of the respondents to my interviews also said that some boys who would arrive with their hair, with their turbans, the local British barbers also recognized that hair is something of great importance to them. So they would not even touch a Sikh boy's hair. So the people like, the mamas and chachas and all the other men who were already there, they would just somehow cut a little bit of the hair and then take the boy or the young man to the barbers so that, the barber would then, give him a proper haircut. And it would be extremely traumatic for the Sikh boy, of course, to, get his hair cut and everything. That was there, of course. So a couple of respondents that I spoke with, they shed light into a new kind of turban, new kind of understanding about the turban issue, and opens new areas of inquiry for us when we talk about why men were getting their hair cut. So one respondent says that I didn't have case hair back then. It was cut in India itself. Almost all Sikhs worked in the foundries. It was tough life and work was very dirty. Iron used to make the place very hot. We would be covered in grime after work and had to bathe every single day. There used to be no showers in the houses back then. Some foundries had their own showers, but I had to go to a common bathing place in Groves Lane. It used to be so cold outside and would snow for months. One had to struggle to keep clean. Being clean shaven was practical and convenient. I grew my hair back as soon as I retired from work. Another experience, this is really interesting. He says, no, I didn't cut my hair for work or anything. I had built my own business soon after coming here. I cut my hair for fashion because when I would look at my other mates, I felt that I looked odd. It used to take me so long to tie the turban and get ready. And when I danced with the ladies in the pub, I felt out of character. I would say now that I had a bit of a complex back then. We were a few boys from army background, and one day we all cut our hair together. Once we'd done it, there was nothing that our parents could say. The many migrants were also, like we keep hearing about how migrants were all there, to settle and everything. But there were a lot of migrants who were disillusioned with the harshness of life in England as well. A few men went back to India. And here I'm sharing one experience. It's really sad. And I could see the sadness in the person's eyes as well when I was conversing with him outside a Gurdwara in Birmingham. He says, when I went to India to get married, so he was at first here in England, he was working and all, and then he went back to get married. When I went back to India to get married, I didn't come back. For about for about 16 months, I stayed there, and my first child was also born there. But then the taunts began. People began saying things like, why have you come back? Why are you not going back? Did you do something wrong in England? But I did not relent. I had no intention of coming back. The people, however, did not stop. And even my in-laws began saying things like, we got our daughter married to you so that she could see England. You are now not moving from here only, and things like that. So, eventually all that pressure built up on him. And then he had to come back to England. And he says, my wife also started working in a sewing factory. We had 2 more children. We saved up to buy our house and moved out of my father's and brother's place. Then the kids began to go to school, and the question of returning to India for good just vanished into thin air. Life is good here. We have a lot of facilities like transport and NHS, but I have always hated the weather. Ever since my retirement, I have been to India every year during the winters and stay there for as long as I like. 3-4 months, 2-3 months. So, all that kind of extreme, this thing about being kind of caught in England, not just by choice, but because of so much of familial pressure as well.
Vijayta, your time is up.
Oh, no. I'll just take 2 to 3 minutes more. Okay, very quickly, because this is an important part. Migration research, with very few notable exceptions, has very recently started giving attention to the aspect of women's experiences. The current share of women in world's population of international migration is close to half, but there is a striking lack of gender analysis in migration literature, which focuses mostly on economic and labor market variables. Kaufman et al. Have argued that the few researchers that do focus on women's migration patterns experiences mainly do so by analyzing them as companions of men and not as separate individuals. They go on to say that such researchers assume that women have similar experiences as men, and women's agency is seldom explored. This is why the stories of early Sikh women migrants do not find place in the dominant narrative of Sikh migration to the UK. I'll very quickly just read out 2 or 3 experiences. So an interview with a woman who migrated with a family as a child really depicts how sometimes women are in fact bereft of individuality or agency. So this one lady I found, she could only speak in Punjabi. She had never been to school. So she said, why I didn't go to school, I really don't know. My parents would be able to answer that. I used to just help my mother with the household work. I didn't even learn English, but my kids and husband accompany me everywhere. So, I never went anywhere alone. I'm just living my life like this in England, like that, However, with the passage of time, Sikhs realized that they were here to stay, and objections to women working and gaining employment was kind of, it waned. And food and clothing industries were the biggest employers of Sikh women. Below is the testimony of an octogenarian woman, which gives a glimpse into the life of early women migrants who had to do hard domestic labor along with a regular job. When asked about her early life in England, all she could remember was how difficult it was to live without modern gadgets. Later, the availability of which must have had like transformational impact on her life. She also must have been economically exploited, but seemed very happy with the benefits she got after retiring. So she said that when we came here in 1959, there was nothing here. No fridge, no washing machine, nothing. We used to go to a public place to wash clothes. There used to be machines to dry clothes there only. Nobody had cars back then. There was no gas fire. We used coal fire. The first thing we brought was a fridge, then heater to make tea, but no washing machine for a very long time. Now we have everything, and the council even puts free central heating for people who cannot afford. Old people get a lot of benefits. Just imagine back then there was no liquid soap also. We used to use a washing bar like a desi soap, but now there is everything. I used to work in a tailoring factory, and my husband worked as a weaver in a chair manufacturing factory. Earlier, we were not aware of any benefits, and no woman was aware of the laws. We only knew we had to work, get our stamps, and then get pension. Now our girls are educated and work in social services. They tell us about the law and how to do things, and they even give benefits to the people who don't know about them. So, the latter part of this experience resonates with the observation that Asian women were the worst of all British workers. They are at the bottom of the heap. They come unprepared, easy victims to unscrupulous employers. They do not know the language, so their choice of jobs is limited to the worst and least skilled. They don't know their rights, and so they can be intimidated. They don't have much information about other better off workers, so they can be paid poverty wages. Neither their husbands, nor families, nor white trade unionists or middle class Asians were keen to help them. So I just basically wanted to bring in new perspectives about early Sikh migration, and there are a couple of other things that I had to say, but I'll just leave it at that. Thank you for like the extra time.
Thank you very much indeed, Vijayta. That was illuminating in the extreme. It's now my pleasure to introduce Sweta Kumari, who is a doctoral candidate in the School of International Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. And as far as I know, Sweta is going to be speaking about merits and prejudices, a historical overview of immigration in the United States. And we look forward to your presentation. And then after that, we will have the opportunity for some discussion based on the questions that have been sent in. And then we will, of course, have to wrap up, ready for the next session of this conference. Thank you, Sweta.
Thank you so much, Chair, for the kind introduction. A very good morning and greetings to all. I hope I am properly audible. I would like to first thank Nepal Institute of International Cooperation and Engagement for allowing me to participate in this conference based on such an important and relevant issue. And it is an extreme honor for me to be speaking among such experts in the panel. So coming to the United States, so recently the country has witnessed a very dramatic transfer of presidency from Donald Trump to Joseph Biden. And this was an election, one of a kind election in the history of US. And immigration was one of the most contentious issues during this election. So my presentation, however, more than the ongoing issues, it focuses on the relevance of immigration in the history of United States and what constitutes as the merit for a migrant to move to the US, and how these standards of merits have changed from time to time in the course of the history of the country. So if we look at the course of immigration in the US, it is actually in a way looking at the history of the country itself. As President John F. Kennedy used to say, America as a nation of immigrants. So it is a country that has been established by the migrants who moved from European countries in the 17th century, who faced religious persecution and other atrocities in their countries, and they moved and they sailed through the Atlantic Ocean to a far land in the pursuit of building a nation that was idealized by John Winthrop as a city shining upon the hill. A nation that would be the beacon of freedom and democracy and opportunities, and it will be a kind of inspiration to the masses. So in due course of time, millions of people, it started from Europe, but millions of people from every nook and corner of the world arrived US, speaking different language, having different ethnic backgrounds. They influxed in the US, and they all came chasing the American dream, a dream that still in its full fervor is longed by thousands of people across the world. So first of all, I'd like to talk about this American dream. What constitutes as the American dream that people are so in a way crazy about? So the basic components of American dream is that there will be freedom, there will be freedom of individuality, there will be democracy, and most importantly, there will be opportunities for a person to grow, to succeed. So what one wants to become, one becomes in America. That's the ideal notion. And it is a country where merit is rewarded, hard work is rewarded. So that is the ideal conception of American dream. But uh, scholars like Robert K. Martin, they have questioned this opportunity, that there is opportunity in the US to grow, but is this opportunity an equal opportunity for all? So this will be the main basis of my presentation today. So if we look from the beginning, there has been some merits. If one qualified, one had those merits or qualities, they were qualified or they were welcomed in the United States. Other were maybe in the disadvantageous category, but even they moved, and how was their struggle and how they assimilated in the society. So it started with the migrants who moved in the 17th century from the northwestern Europe, facing religious persecution. So they were the first settlers in America, and and from there the idea of forming a nation, United States, began. So what was the criteria then? So it would be a Christian country based on Protestant values. It will be a predominantly English speaking population, and of course the Caucasian race from the northwestern part of the Europe. So that were the standards of merit in the US. But with uh, time, people from other parts of the world also started coming. So uh, with the westward expansion in the US, so there was the rumor of the gold rush, that in California there are golden mountains, and people from countries like China, they fled in ships in thousands of numbers. And when they went there, they realized that it was all it was just a bad dream, and they went there. And so and then in the 19th century itself, people from other countries of the US, from the eastern part or southeastern part, they also fled, facing either religious persecution or poverty, and they moved to the US. But first I'll talk about the other European countries, then I'll come to the Asian ones. So when they reached there, they were Christians, they were Europeans, and but they did not match the standard of merits that was set by early settlers. They were Christians, but many of them were practicing Catholicism. So that was a point of demerit. Uh, there were Irish who went at that time, but Irish were from the northwestern part, I'm sorry. But they were the disadvantageous point for the Irish were their Catholic faith. Similarly, when Italians and people from Greece and they went there, so they were in a way they were of that Caucasian race, but 1 degree lesser white than the whites from the northwestern Europe. So they were discriminated on that background as well. So the standards of merit, it was so different for every community. And when the Chinese reached America, so they were in a way the most uh, disadvantageous group. They were not their religion was different, their language was different, they were not from Europe, they were from an oriental unknown land, they looked different. So there was nothing for the Chinese to claim an acceptance in the American society at that point of time, which led to the formation of the passage of this hatred among for Chinese. It led to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. And they were, in many places, they were persecuted, they were discriminated. And that's why they used to live in small pockets in different parts of the country. And that's why there are so many Chinatowns in New York, in San Francisco. So we find a lot of Chinatowns there. Then there is another community in the US, which the famous historian Thomas Sowell calls as they were the only ethnic or racial community that were brought against their will in the US. So that community are the African Americans. So the blacks were brought there as slaves. So they, first of all, they were not willing, they did not come there with a willingness, they were forcefully brought to the US. And they were so they were slaves at that time. So there was no point of there was not even a question of any merit to their existence itself. So this is how the merits and advantages and prejudices have been the part of the journey of the United States. But in the 1960s, the Hart-Celler Act, or the Immigration and Naturalization Act, was signed by President Johnson. So after that, it opened the channels for many South Asians and people from any part of the world, on the basis of their skills, their knowledge basis, on the basis of merit, they were allowed in the United States. So it was then when South Asian Indians, people from Nepal and other parts of the region, they started influxing in the US. So now, after 1960s, knowledge and skills, they got a priority over religion and ethnicity and everything. So this was the priority for entry in the US. There is a different story of assimilation, and so we will talk about that later. So this is how the pattern of merits that has taken place in the US. So if we come back to the present time, so President Trump, so he took immigration to a different level, and his presidency was one of a kind. So what he did, he took up some very rash decisions, like building a wall again in the Mexican border, restricting the work visa, the H-1B visa, and the protected status that was given to Nepali migrants, all these were stopped by his administration. And there were bans to immigrants from a particular, from many nations who belong to a particular religion. So now the merit was totally different. So all these have been inherited by the Biden administration, which is in charge right now. So it will be very interesting to see that we can expect an ease in the immigration policy, because we can see the diversity they have in their administration. The vice president itself, she is a woman of black origin and a descent from South Asia. So we will expect some easement in the immigration policy, but it will be interesting to see how much they are able to implement it, given the fact that even the Trump administration, the period or the tenure of Trump administration is over. But the Trumpism will continue for a time, because one important element of Trump that appeased to the Americans, to the working class Americans, was his protectionist idea that they need to protect jobs of middle class working Americans. So the allowance of immigrants, especially on work visa, it will be questioned, because there are a lot of people who in the American society who believe that their jobs are being snatched or they are taken by the immigrants who reach to their country. So it will be very interesting to see that how they will be able to balance this. But US has been a nation of immigrants. The immigrants have decided the course of the history of the US, the culture that has developed. So the immigrants will, they have determined the past of the US, and they will continue to determine the ongoing future of the American society as well. So said that, and there will be merits that will be keep on changing from time to time. We have seen that even in the past, at one point of time, a community that, or a race that used to be, or an ethnicity that used to be in a privileged position, that was undermined given the international dynamics or the domestic ones. For example, the Germans were the first early settlers in the US. So they were the part of that, the original standards of merit in the US. But during the World War time, they were severely targeted or persecuted in America. So were the Japanese. So this will keep on happening. So we see a lot of news going on immigration, but immigration is not something new in the US, and these merits and disadvantages and prejudices will keep on being the important element of the US political, cultural history and future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant timing, Sweta. Well done. I think we'd better head straight into questions, but I'm aware that there are more questions for our first speaker than there are for either you or for Dr. Mahendru. So if people have got questions, do send them in, and we have probably half an hour. Are we allowed half an hour for questions if necessary? I hope so.
Ma'am, we have 45 minutes more to go. We would like to hear something from you also.
Well, shall I say something now, or shall we have the questions? If I speak now, it gives more people a chance to send in some questions. I'm aware of that.
That is up to you.
I think all I will say at this point from my own perspective is that as somebody who's been a specialist in religion in relation to migration and settlement, of course, I'm deeply interested in the three presentations that we've had, both in the way that religion has been overtly mentioned in the case, for example, of specifically Sikh settlement in the UK, and as we've just heard, in relation to merits and demerits for immigrants to the United States, and also the unspoken significance of religion in the mass migration and turmoil of 1947, when, of course, Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh identities were so supremely significant in the dislocation, relocation, and bloodshed. And I think I'm right in saying that there aren't any sessions specifically devoted to the intersection of religion and migration trajectories. So I would just be asking people to be alert throughout the day during presentations to that particular strand of religious identity, religious commitment, religious adaptation, because certainly, to take Vijayta's example of the Sikhs in the UK, it was not simply that they self-defined as Sikh, but the way in which Sikhism itself is defined has been deeply affected, not just in the diaspora, but for Sikhs everywhere by the diaspora. And I could go on about that, but I'm not going to. I think it's time to head into the questions that patient participants have sent in. The first one is a question for Dr. Bhalla, which is, what could be the reason why India lost so many decades before people began giving attention to partition? What was the apprehension to face its own dark history? I imagine that means how apprehensive were people in facing the dark history of partition?
Yeah, I think there are many reasons why it couldn't happen. One, in the just following partition, there was a huge effort into rebuilding. So a lot of people were busy rebuilding their lives. They weren't thinking about documenting themselves. And there wasn't really a culture in South Asia of documenting history and preserving it the way that, we've seen in the West at that time. And so I don't think, the effort didn't come from the people, one, for that reason. And two, I think the state would have been very discouraging of it. The political atmosphere was never quite right for it. You wouldn't have been able to pull off a cross-border project in India or Pakistan. We were able to do the work that we do and pull it off and kind of ignite this work from the diaspora, And so because we are in places where Indians, Pakistani, Bangladeshis, everybody's, living as citizens of the same country, and we don't think of ourselves as this or that. Those same identity issues that are present in South Asia don't impact us in the same way here. And so I think that's one of the big reasons why, we do have a huge presence now in India and Pakistan and South Asia. I think the fact that we're anchored outside of South Asia makes a huge difference. And that hopefully answers your question.
Thank you so much. I'm going to speed on to the next question for you. Do you think that the modern problems of price hike and economic imbalance in India are all because of the British colonial rule in India and their extraction of Indian wealth?
I know there's been a lot of arguments on British extraction of Indian wealth. I don't think the equation is so straightforward because, again, you had a lot of kingdoms, right? you didn't have all of South Asia under British economic control. And so I think the dynamics are pretty different in that way. But in terms of the price hikes and that sort of the policies around a lot of, like MSP and all these farm laws and whatnot, a lot of these are British era policies, many policies, many different aspects of Indian society. A lot of what you have is a leftover of British era policy that hasn't been reformed and doesn't match modern times and the modern requirements. So yes, I would say that there is still a lot of colonial era stuff that's left over it's outdated now and it needs to be reformed. And yes, it has an impact on the economics.
Thank you very much for that. And I see that one of the participants, Aurobindo Parker, has agreed with you, I think, on the importance of this aspect. There's a question for Vijayta Mahendru, which is not entirely related to the paper, as the questioner admits, but the questioner wants to know how Sikh migrants are reacting to the farmers' agitation in which Sikhs are participating in large numbers and reacting to the negative portrayal by the mainstream media and the party in power.
Thank you so much for this question. In my opinion, there are two issues that are like, it's a very complicated issue. First of all, how a country deals with its diaspora, which is not even a citizen of the country, but the diaspora retains the right to voice its opinions about what's going on in the homeland, so to say, with which it has links. It can be familial links or it can just be cultural links, So nation states, which are this kind of delimited entities, they first of all still have a lot to figure out how to deal with the immense amount of diversity within it. And now increasingly with the fact that identities are spread across the world and people from all over the world can, kind of have links with any particular country. So when those identities begin to assert their right, it's not really like a right that is given to them by someone, but it is their right to voice their opinion. That right any free human being has. So, nation states, the conception really does not kind of know how to understand it and to deal with it. So that is the confusion which is, kind of created with this entire brouhaha about how, Sikhs abroad are all Khalistani supporters and this and that. When it comes to Khalistan, like when it comes to Sikhs voicing their opinions about Indian matters and, them being demonized, it is not anything new for the Sikh diaspora. It has happened in 1984. In a much worse way than it is happening today. Today, all of the anger and everything is just in social media and all. But in 1984, when, people were simply like, after seeing reports of what was happening in the Gurdwara and all of that, people organized these huge rallies to London and outside the embassy. And those people, so many of them faced visa bans for decades to come. And they were under the intelligence, the eyes of the Indian intelligence, and they were surveilled like anything. And I've met some people like that who have then, after many decades, by giving no reason, the government lifted their ban. Because anyway, the government didn't have anything against them. It was just based on a suspicion because they organized a protest. So for Sikhs in the UK only, I can tell, for Sikhs in the UK, this idea of Khalistan, or basically voicing about Khalistan, has more to do with calling for justice. They say that for us, it is not a territorial conception of Khalistan so much, but rather the idea of us being able to speak for ourselves. I do understand that, there is a separatist, I won't deny that there are no separatist agencies at play which are working from abroad, but this is not something that is a recent phenomena or anything. This has been happening before Indian independence, since the time of the how the Sikhs who were settled in North America before Indian independence, they organized the Gadar movement against the British. Similarly, this quasi proto Khalistani movement was organized abroad as well, and it has only grown from there. As the diaspora is growing and it is has made its roots in other places. Similarly, these movements also take new shapes and new forms. So it is a complicated issue. But definitely what we see from here sitting in India is that the nation state is simply not able to comprehend it or deal with it. And so the only thing that's left at its disposal is to demonize a particular identity, because you can differentiate them. If it was an identity like a Hindu identity or something, maybe they wouldn't have any way of discriminating against them. But because you can just call them different, so there is a way of discriminating against them. This is my
Thank you
take
very
on
much,
this issue.
Vijayta. Let's move on to a question for Sweta. So you talked about Trumpism. How was the response of Indian migrants to the defeat of Trump in the context of Howdy Modi and Namaste Trump?
First of all, I would like to say that the Indian community in the United States is not a monolithic community. So there are people from different parts of India, having different political preferences. Yes, like given the fact that the vice presidential candidate was an Indian, was a person with half Indian origin. So it was one of a very important uh, advantage for the Democratic Party, and they left no stone unturned at the time of their campaigning uh, to lure the Indian community, if I can say so. We saw the messages that were sent. It began since I think in August, Kamala Harris was officially nominated as the vice presidential candidate of the Democratic Party. So since then, they have made a very political as well as cultural approach to reach out to the Indian community. So there was a message at the time of at the Independence Day. So there was message of Navratri, there was message of Diwali. So they left no no effort left, so to convince the Indian community to vote against them. So it will take some time to find out how, like there will be reports in coming months or weeks. We will find out that which community voted. The voting patterns will be more clearer in the coming time. But yes, the Democratic Party had a very big advantage of having Kamala Harris as the candidate to lure their votes. If that
Thank you very much.
Ma'am, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Sweta. There's a question which I'm going to direct, initially at least, to Dr. Bhalla, which is, why do you think the Sylhet issue or the partition of Assam is not discussed very much in Indian partition studies? In other words, what are the reasons behind not studying the issue of the partition of Assam?
I think there are some critical issues there. As you know, the whole CAA issue kind of sparked out of Assam. At least from our work, we've definitely done work in Assam, so I don't think we've left it out at all by any means. But we did run into the most resistance there because a lot of people were afraid. They were afraid that their stories, their oral history work with us would somehow, implicate them into these citizenship issues that were happening. So I think in Assam, there is still a lot of incentive for people to kind of keep mum about their histories. People are a little afraid to talk about them, and hence research has been a little bit mum compared to other places. I do believe that you're absolutely right. There is more silence on Assam, and I think there's even more fear now than there was before, because after the whole CAA stuff happened, people are just not, they don't want to have anything to do with, most people, like a project that's going to be documenting their partition era story.
Thank you very much for that. Vijayta.
I just wanted to add one more point here. The history of Northeast in general is kind of very sidelined in India. And I think that could be one of the reasons why the history of partition in Assam is also sidelined. And the other thing is that when it comes to partition, even Bengalis have this thing that when people talk about partition, they focus mostly on the partition of Punjab and slightly less on Bengal. So yeah, these are issues that remain in the discipline, I think. But I know Guneeta's work, it has a lot of, they do work in Bengal, definitely.
We have actually more stories from Bengal than Punjab in our archive.
Yeah, yes, I've seen that. But in general, before you came into the scene, I'm saying.
Thank you both. I see that we're perfectly on time for wrapping up after 90 minutes, but if there is leeway and anybody feels that something else needs to be said, then I'm available, but I don't know what our organisers' view is on this.
Professor, we can take 10 minutes if anyone is interested to share their questions or views.
So do seize this opportunity. If you have a question, do submit it. I'm personally very interested in the way in which our presenters' research is moving, and partly how it has changed since they set out, and partly what they feel is the burning topic or the issue which they want to address next in this context of migration studies. So I don't know if any of the presenters would like to share on how their objectives and their interpretation and so on has shifted, or what they are moving into next.
I can speak to that. I think our project is so long term that we're gonna probably we are going to remain focused on partition. We're an organization, it's part of our mission, but we are going to be looking at, after we hit the 10,000 mark, we are going to start also, in addition to continuing oral history work of witnesses, we are going to start looking at the next generation and the following generation. But it's going to be a little different than oral history because they didn't experience partition, but just how the memories have impacted them and how that continues to manifest itself in modern South Asian culture, economics, and so on. Oh, I think you're on mute.
I look forward to hearing more of your project as it unrolls.
Thank you.
Brilliant. And time is of the essence, as you say.
Yeah, definitely.
The generation in their 80s and 90s now.
Definitely.
Sweta, have you got something to say?
I am a student of United States Studies program in the School of International Studies, JNU. So it was such a fascinating topic for me, immigration and in the US. So I was fascinated to present a paper on this, since we have been studying the society and culture and the political culture of the US. So I was very intrigued with this topic to present it here. As per my field of research, I'm working on the health practices of the US. So my area of research is complementary and integrative approaches in the US healthcare system. So it is in a way not about the people as immigrants, but the foreign health practice that have imbibed in the culture of the US, and people are practicing them, and that has led to a discourse of an integrative health where there are now discourses of a more coordinated in a more coordinated synchronizing the conventional medical system and these body and mind practices that have originated from in different parts of the world, especially this region. My first presentation, my first association with NIICE was it was in September. So there I presented a paper on integrative approach to health security and the prospect of India and its neighbors. So many of the practices like yoga, meditation, Ayurveda, they have originated in the Indian subcontinent, in India, Nepal. So all these countries have a big role to play in the coming, since we have faced such a big health crisis, and we are still facing it. So how we can, with a more integrative approach, we can move toward holistic health. So I'm studying that in the US. So my so it's the immigration of health practices rather than people, if I may.
Thanks very much for that. And I see Vijayta has added a question in the chat. What is the importance of oral histories in formal history writing? What importance does history discipline give to oral histories? And I suspect she would be able to start the answer to that question, unless somebody else wants to.
Sorry, I forgot to mention the question was directed to Guneeta.
Aha. Okay.
Would you mind repeating it fully? I know it was about oral history. I didn't quite catch the full question.
Shall I repeat it? Or do you want to, Vijayta?
Okay, I'll repeat it. Guneeta, what is the importance of oral histories in formal history writing? And what importance does the history discipline, the formal discipline of history as we have today, give to oral histories?
Yeah, in the Western world, that shift is, there's been a huge shift, and oral histories are quite acceptable here and considered very integral and important. In South Asia, I've noticed that shift is just beginning, and oral histories aren't 100% accepted yet. From my perspective, it is another source of information, and this is information that you're not going to find in a document archive. And a lot of people will argue like, well, there could be discrepancies in people's memories and so on. Well, it turns out that there are discrepancies in the document archive as well. It's, it was a human who created that document, and there can be a lot of errors that, sometimes decades and centuries later are corrected. So one way with oral histories is that you can have multiple sources that are unrelated, talk about the same event, and you can connect the dots between similarities.
Okay, thank you. Ma'am, actually, I was raising my hand to tell about what I think about my future research.
Yes, please tell us.
Yeah. So for me, I am on a quest to understand how nation states can live with the already existing as well as increasing diversity. So that's what I am directing my research on, and I'm really trying to write some papers and get into a postdoctoral program so that I can focus more on this quest of mine. That's all.
So we have plenty to look forward to in the future from our three presenters. It's been a pleasure introducing you all, and I hope that contact will continue in future. And I would like to say thank you very much indeed to NIICE for the privilege of being involved in this opening session of this splendid conference with all its potential.
Thank you, Professor Nesbit. Distinguished chair and speakers, ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of the first session. It is my honor to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of NIICE to all who have graced us with their presence and contributed their part to make this event a resounding success. First of all, I would like to express my profound gratitude and sincere thanks to Professor Eleanor Nesbit for agreeing to share this session early morning at 3 a.m. We sincerely thanks all our speakers, Dr. Guneeta Bhalla, Dr. Vijayta, Mahendru, and Sweta Kumari, for being part of this event and delivering such a comprehensive and convincing presentation. We are really honored to have all the speakers with us here today. We'd also like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the media, academic committee, and other different organizations. Finally, I must also mention our deep sense of appreciation for our audience who participated in this webinar and those who are watching us live on YouTube. Thank you all for available time and attention and for making this session productive with your questions. We are truly honored to have you all with us this morning and hope to stay connected with you in future as well. It's really been a pleasure. And also do join to our next session. Thank you very much.